Our next speaker is David Malpass, president of the World Bank. David has a long and distinguished career in American government and private enterprise. He's worked at the highest levels of the Treasury and State Departments in 3 different administrations, dating back to the Reagan years. He was also a chief economist at Bear Stearns when there was a Bear Stearns. In his current role, David works with countries and NGOs to provide financing and technical assistance to help them solve their most intractable problems. And today, he will take us on a world tour and tell us what the bank's global priorities are for 2021 and beyond. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome David Malpass.
Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here today for the Imagine Solutions Conference, and my special thanks to Steve Einhorn for the invitation. I want to talk with you today about some of the challenges faced at the World Bank Group, some of the challenges facing the developing world and the global landscape. As you know, we are in a whole new world in terms of the economic decline that occurred in 2020, the inequality that's built up in the world, the importance of vaccines, the importance and the magnitude of debt overhanging the developing world. So these are all challenges that I want to mention and also try to lay out some ideas about what the core of the problem is and what some of the solutions are. One that I'm going to mention is the importance of transparency in contracts. One of the problems that's built up in the world over the years for the developing countries is the lack of transparency in the contracting process and the core importance of contracts within the way the global system works. So we should talk about that. I wanted to first describe the World Bank Group. The World Bank is composed of actually 5 entities. I won't go through them all, but suffice it to say, there's a bank-like entity called IBRD and IDA, which makes loans and grants to developing countries, to the poorer countries especially. It's made up of, there's equity capital, there's debt that we issue into the markets. So in the previous fiscal year, we did over $90 billion of debt in the World Bank Group, and it'll be more than that in our current fiscal year because of the surge in lending that's going on. In addition to those 2 entities, one that's a bank charging interest, one that's IDA, which is very soft loan terms and heavily grants, and it's replenished by donors. There's also IFC, the International Finance Corporation, which has equity capital. It issues debt, and it helps fund debt and equity investments in private sector companies. MIGA is the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, which can guarantee political risk, which helps enable investments in developing countries, which of course is critical to job creation, to stability in those fragile states and other aspects of development. And the 5th one is ICSID, the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, which I won't go into today, but it's an aspect of the World Bank's group's work. All of it focused on how do you get more development with the clear mission that we want to alleviate poverty. We want to have shared prosperity, meaning all elements of society moving up in terms of their living standards, their median income, their connection with the rest of the world, their participation in global public goods in a favorable way, such as climate change. All of those are part of shared prosperity and having a better outlook for the people of developing countries. So that's the goal. And there's a recognition that there are many types of tools that a multilateral institution like the World Bank Group can use with countries to help them in their efforts. I wanted to describe how we're approaching that and then get to some of the real challenges. When I came in at the World Bank Group in April of 2019, I had been working with the World Bank really since the mid 1980s. So I was both on as a staffer on Capitol Hill at the Senate Budget Committee, and then as Deputy Assistant Secretary at Treasury for Developing Nations. The World Bank was one aspect and an important aspect of the development policies of the United States. As I came in April of 2019, what I wanted the World Bank people to think very much in terms of good country outcomes. How do we get a development program that really works for countries and for regions within? For example, the Sahel region in Africa faces many common problems in terms of desertification, of security problems, and immigration challenges, and of course, simply living standards. How do you make a living in a very harsh environment? So as the World Bank interacts with that, we try to have we have country directors in very many countries, and also in the smaller countries, a country manager, and they're part of an operation system within the bank within the World Bank group that tries to identify the tools that will work best in a given country. They have dialogue with the governments. They create documents within the World Bank that frames a strategy for the country, and then they bring operations through the operations committee at the bank, and the bank will make a grant or a loan, a very low interest rate loan, or in some cases a floating rate. Currently LIBOR, though we're switching over rapidly to SOFR, or preparing the contracts for the new benchmark floating interest rate. So all of those activities are core, and we wanted to we realigned personnel in 2019 and 2020, and it went smoothly to put people closer to their clients. So that means more people in country working with the governments. There's, as in any big organization, there's personnel turnover. So we've hired very effective people in all parts of the organization to benefit this effort. And our finances have gone well over that period of time. There's been a big capital increase, meaning an equity injection in the IBRD. There was a replenishment of IDA, the soft loan window, in December of 2019, enabling $82 billion of financing over the next 3 years. So that's starting in July of 2020. There's the resources to have a large net positive flow to the poorest countries and to the developing world as a whole. And then IFC also had a capital increase that was finished early in 2020, which is a big expansion of the equity capital of IFC. So as a result of that funding, the bank was able to have a record year in calendar year 2020. It was up 45% in commitments from calendar year 2019. So that's a big increase. It's very powerful because of the funding that's available and also the needs of the developing countries. So there's a two-way street where the country needs to want to interact with various parts of the World Bank, and then the World Bank to have resources available for that kind of expansion. So to give you some color on how this works, we look at potential programs, support programs for individual countries. That might be Nigeria or Kenya or Ethiopia or Egypt, or in Asia, Myanmar, which has to be examined in light of political changes, in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and all of Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Philippines, and in Latin America. Most all of the countries have World Bank group programs to varying degrees. So that allows people, the country and the World Bank, to work together to focus on challenges. And I want to tell you a couple more, and then talk more globally about economic problems. So when the pandemic hit in April of March of 2020, the World Bank group, people started working from home. That was able to be done quite effectively. There was a good technology, IT capabilities at the bank, and people were able to get a lot of their work done. As I said, the commitments are up very large, the biggest increase on record, I think, in calendar 2020, as a result of being able to push operations through the investment committee and to the board for approval. So in April and May, we worked on very rapid COVID response, and were able to reach 112 countries with a menu of things that we could help them with, such as masks, such as personal protective equipment, also the services and consulting that they need in order to be able to combat the COVID impact. Some of that also took the form of social safety net support, where the World Bank is very, very engaged. We're trying to have systems that target people that are most in need. And that means adjusting. For some countries, they need to constantly be updating the list of people that are qualified for the social safety net, because happily, people do move upward in these countries. And so in order to target the benefits, there need to be dynamic changes going on in the country. So that was part of the program. By August and September, it became apparent that the vaccines were going to be a challenge for the developing world. We set up a program that was approved by the board in October for $12 billion of financing for vaccine purchases and distribution by developing countries. So if you can imagine, that might extend to 1 billion people. Some of the manufacturers are giving discounts for vaccines that are available to developing countries. And so we're working hard on that, but we did an assessment of countries, their readiness for vaccination programs, and where the gaps are in terms of their logistics, their training, and tried to fill those gaps in. So that was work underway in November and December, and we were able to do assessments in nearly 100 countries to prepare for vaccination systems, and then began bringing operations to the board at the end of January, and then into February, with individual operations coming to the board, where the country can identify or it can explain what it intends to do with financing, and then how the contracts can be entered into. It presented a lot of challenges, from the logistics, the training aspect, the availability of delivery schedules from the manufacturers. So we engaged with both the manufacturers and with COVAX, the international facility, to try to obtain delivery schedules and prices and contracting capabilities for the countries. So I wanted to give you that background, and that brings me up more to the challenges in 2021. And I'll identify some, and as you know, there are many, many challenges. One is inequality, meaning the K-shaped recovery that's underway worldwide, where the upper end goes up and the bottom end has suffered from severe unemployment, from the inability to send remittances back home to their families, the debt burdens that have gone up because of as a percentage, because of the recession itself. Many of the developing countries have seen their GDP fall by 10%, and so their debt to GDP levels have gone up correspondingly. So these are big problems, and they add on to the original problems, which included health, education, nutrition, child development, also violence against women, and challenges in incorporating women into the workforce, insecurity or security issues in countries in fragile states. All of these are ones that we're facing. In order to address the challenges of the developing world, IFC was an important element of it. in April and in May, we identified that countries and companies were having a very hard time getting trade finance and working capital finance. IFC created an expandable program that was able to reach many companies and fill the gap that had emerged in the markets. The markets were reluctant to do trade finance, working capital finance in developing countries during that period of uncertainty, and IFC was able to fill that gap, and working with MIGA created systems to help with correspondent banking problems, with trade problems, working capital problems. And so that's been a successful effort to try to maintain some of the private sector operations in developing countries. And that's going to be a critical building block as we go forward into the future. So as I turn to that longer term now, I wanted to explain that we know that the post-COVID world is going to be different in many ways from the pre-COVID. One of the keys for success for the developing countries will be their flexibility, their ability to change into the new environment. A clear example of that is countries that depended on tourism will probably have to have a much downsized view of tourism and a different aspect of tourism, perhaps greener, more about biodiversity, more about safety and security, all of those things changing the nature of the experience in the developing countries. That's just one example. In every area, there are changes going on. One of the biggest now is the emergence of food insecurity as a critical problem facing many of the fragile countries. This is in part due to the economic recession, meaning that simply less income for people in the countries, fewer remittances, and so less money to buy food. And then also challenges facing the crops that are related to climate changes, related to the yields on crops, and the complexity of the international agricultural system. I think there are fruitful ways to invest in that for the developing world. And so we look at that as agri-industry, agribusiness, policies that are climate friendly. Those are one of the many core functions of the World Bank, joining health, education, the vaccination programs, the climate programs, the gender awareness programs that recognize that women are going to be a critical part of a developing country's success going forward, because they make up a big portion of the potential labor force and earning power. So all of those are challenges that we face. I wanted to turn to the longer term, as we think about how developing countries can set up. I want to mention the importance of their spending priorities, their taxation priorities, and these have been problematic areas all through the history of developing world. We have programs, we work with the IMF carefully on these programs, and we also are trying to use the debt reduction process that's underway now to help channel more resources into the fiscal accounts of the countries so that they can make more choices, favorable choices for the people of the country. I want to mention also the challenge of to achieve a sustainable debt burden. Prior to COVID-19, there had been many years of rapidly expanding debt for developing countries. This poses a challenge for the international financial system because sovereign debt doesn't have a bankruptcy and established bankruptcy process the way company debt does in many of the advanced economies. And so it creates a very real conflict between the boundaries that countries can push in terms of getting more financing and using it effectively versus the litigation and the force of the international rule of law that is applied to sovereign debt. And so I think there's been a somewhat unhealthy process, a lack of transparency in the debt itself, in the contracts, both from the creditor side, they don't want to share information on what the contract looks like, and from the debtor side, the government of the country may not want people to know what the debt contracts look like or what the collateral was that was used to induce the contract. And so these are highly problematic even prior to COVID, and COVID placed an urgency on resolving this and pushing this problem forward. What we did in March, I called for, and joined by Kristalina Georgieva at the IMF, called for a suspension of debt payments, a moratorium on the official bilateral credits and the private sector credits that are in the poorest countries. That's 75 of the poorer countries, many of whom are over indebted, had overextended themselves, and we need a process. So the moratorium was supposed to give time for the international system to sort out some of this set of problems: the litigation problem, the amount of debt, the high interest rates that are charged on quite a bit of the debt, the collateral that might be involved in the debt, and work to a more sustainable future for the international debt system. It's been problematic to implement this because the creditors are reluctant to fully participate. Both the private sector creditors and some of the official bilateral creditors have been reluctant to participate. In the meantime, the World Bank group provides a very large positive net flow to the countries to support them as they look for various approaches to dealing with the debt. So that process is ongoing. It was featured in the G20 meetings, the group of 20 large country meetings that occurred in 2020, and it will be also a major part of the agenda in 2021 for both the G20 and for the G7. Some of the principles that we want to really push forward with are transparency. I've mentioned that. Also, an ability to reduce the debt burden for those countries that are in debt distress. So if the debt to GDP ratio or the debt to export ratios have gotten very high, there needs to be a step down function for the country in terms of the debt burden, perhaps through a very generous rescheduling of the debt of both the private sector creditors and the official bilateral creditors. So we're working with the IMF on ways to get that done, and individual countries, it will go on a case-by-case basis, but there's this broader challenge that the debt is simply too heavy for the people of the developing countries. Sometimes their governments have a shorter term viewpoint. The government wants the money now and cares a little bit less about what happens 5 years or 10 years from now than the people of the country who are going to reside in that country for decades, and their children will be there for decades. So we're trying to reconcile the interests of the people of the country with the debtors and creditors who may sign contracts that are unfavorable to the people of the country, and that's a tall order to work out, to sort out, and that work is going on in 2021. I wanted to mention another challenge, which is the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs. This is part of the Paris Agreement. Countries 5 years ago put together, sometimes in haste, commitments to the Paris Agreement, and so sorting those out in a way that's consistent with their development policies and their development needs, the people of the country, and having an actually effective interaction with climate change. So lowering greenhouse gas emissions, for example, being a higher priority within the country's choice of NDCs. That wasn't necessarily the highest priority when they were put together in the previous round of NDCs. So we're working with the countries to try to have effective address of the climate goals that the country has, the Paris Agreement has, and consistent with the development purposes of the country, and effective use of funds as the country. For example, there may be many things that a country can do. It's important to find the ones that are going to be most effective in the near term to actually address the combined goals of development and creating a green, resilient recovery for the world that addresses the climate change issues. I want to also mention the broader context of global public goods as we try to build a green, resilient, inclusive development process for the developing world. It's important that global public goods have avenues for being expressed. Otherwise, it's in one country's interest to ignore the effect it has on other countries. And so we have to have economic systems that take this into account. The World Bank is in the center of trying to have countries be aware of their impact on other countries. So I'll give you various examples. One is the biodiversity, where the farmers in a country may want to chop down the rainforest. That is not in the interest of people elsewhere in the country or in the world, and it's not good economics. Marine plastics is a critical issue where if it's dumped into rivers, it goes into the oceans and it accumulates and harms different parts of the ecosphere. World fisheries are a classic example of a global public good that needs to be monitored and maintained and expanded. Well, I've gone on a while. I wanted to give you lots of food for thought. I want to turn to a tough issue, maybe a couple more issues. One is, as we think about the inequality, I want to come back to that. The way the pandemic hit, it exacerbated or made very clear how unequal the world is in terms of the economic stabilization and stimulus. The fiscal stimulus, much of it went to people with higher incomes because they were identified in the system, they had jobs, they may have lost a formal sector job, but people in the informal sector had much harder time getting benefits. So there's an inherent inequality in the fiscal stimulus. The bigger the stimulus, the more the inequality that can come out of that. It's important to target that kind of stimulus. And also, I think, very important to have it funded with long maturity debt. I think governments in the crisis itself issued a lot of short-term debt, and I think that should be rolled into longer-term debt very aggressively by the advanced economies. There was also a huge amount of monetary stimulus that took the form of central banks borrowing from banks through this excess reserve process and buying largely long-term debt instruments from the market, which inherently pushes money into the concentrated upper income sectors of the society. The magnitude of this shift, this inequality shift, is gigantic because of the amounts of debt that were moved in this direction. The amounts of long-term, long-duration instruments owned by the world's central banks has gone way up. And so I think one thing that would soften the damage from that, the inequality damage, is to shorten the maturity of the instruments and also shorten the credit risk or reduce the credit risk of the long-term instruments that are taken by the central banks. So with that, I conclude we're living in this drastically changed world. We're in a low for long interest rate environment that hasn't been reconciled with finance theory, with the idea of return on investment, with the idea of what some of the limits on equity valuation are if interest rates are truly very low for a long time. And those, I think, financial theories or or models need to be discussed and worked out, and then applied also to investments in developing countries. They're very much getting less funding because they don't qualify within the risk metrics that the world has set out. So we're left with a flaw in the system from the debt world standpoint. So if our goal is to help people, and I think we all live on the same planet, and we can recognize that there are clear benefits from people in developing countries doing better. That reduces refugee flow, that reduces the tensions in the world and the political risks, the military risks, some of the security risks. I think we need to practice much more aggressively transparency in contracting, identifying low-cost digital systems that will allow people to participate more fully in their economies countries, even the poorest, should be able to transact in this world where financial transactions can be done at fractions of a cent on the dollar, and lower carbon progress in terms of the transition fuels that can be used for cooking, for electricity generation, all of these systems that need to be updated and made transparent and made very with an urgency that includes vaccinations, that includes rule of law changes that improve the outlook for all of the developing world. With that, thank you very much. I hope it's been interesting. I look forward to input from people. We work closely with IMF, with our shareholders, with other international institutions, with civil society organizations, and of course, very much with the private sector and the business community, where lots and lots of the jobs need to be created. So I wish you all good fortune in your activities. Thanks.